Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The patrol cabin. I spent 2 seasons as a seasonal backcountry ranger for a national forest in northern Idaho, stationed at a remote patrol cabin accessible only by a 9-mile trail, with no road access at all, resupplied by packstring roughly once every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on weather and trail conditions. The job mostly involved maintaining trail, checking permits on the handful of backpackers who came through that drainage, and serving as the nearest thing to an emergency contact for an area that took search and rescue teams the better part of a day to reach under good conditions. I should say more about what that isolation actually felt like on a practical level, because it matters for how I've weighed my own credibility on this account ever since. The 9-mile trail crosses 2 creek fords that become genuinely hazardous after heavy rain, climbs over a 4,000-foot pass, and drops into a drainage that gets, by the district's own estimate, somewhere under 200 visitor days a year across the entire season, spread thin enough that entire weeks can pass with nobody coming through at all. Cell service doesn't exist anywhere in that drainage, and the radio I had was line of sight dependent on a repeater that worked reliably most days, but occasionally dropped out entirely during certain weather patterns, leaving me, for stretches of a day or 2 at a time, with no functioning communication beyond a satellite messenger reserved for genuine emergencies. I want to be clear that I went into that job with full awareness of what that kind of isolation does to a person's mind over time, and I'd done enough remote work in the years before to trust my own baseline for distinguishing between genuine perceptual unease and something objectively unusual happening around me. I wasn't a first-season hire white-knuckling through unfamiliar solitude. I'd specifically requested that posting, in fact, because I liked the particular quality of silence that comes with that level of remoteness, which makes it all the more frustrating, even now, that I can't simply write off what happened as an inexperienced reaction to an unfamiliar environment. The cabin itself was built in the 1930s by a CCC crew, solid old log construction, a single main room with a sleeping loft, a wood stove, and a covered porch that looked out over a wide meadow before the timber resumed on the far side. It had no electricity beyond a small solar setup that ran a radio and basic lighting, no running water beyond a hand pump connected to a nearby spring, and a level of isolation that took real adjustment even for someone who'd done plenty of remote work before taking the job. The meadow itself was the cabin's main practical asset for the job, since it gave a clear view in most directions for spotting smoke or approaching weather, and over 2 seasons I'd come to know its exact contours and the way the light fell across it at different times of day better than I'd ever known any landscape before. The porch itself deserves a bit more description, because its specific construction is part of why what I heard was so unmistakable rather than ambiguous. It ran the full width of the cabin's south-facing side, roughly 30 feet long, built from wide rough-cut boards that had settled and warped slightly over 9 decades in a way that gave each board a distinct, individual creak depending on where exactly you stepped. I'd memorized that creak pattern without ever consciously trying to, the way you learn the specific sounds of any space you inhabit daily, and that familiarity turned out to matter a great deal for how I was able to assess what happened later that summer. The supply situation added its own layer to how isolated the posting actually was. A packstring would come in roughly every 2 to 3 weeks with fresh food, mail, and any equipment I'd requested on the prior trip's radio log, usually accompanied by whichever district staff happened to be assigned to run that cycle, which meant my only reliable in-person human contact for the entire season came in these brief, logistics-focused visits that rarely lasted more than an hour before the crew needed to start back out to make camp before dark elsewhere on their circuit. Between those visits, the only voices I heard were my own and whatever came through faintly on the radio during scheduled check-ins, which made the eventual arrival of unexplained footsteps feel, in a strange way, almost like a violation of the specific silence I'd come to depend on as the defining feature of that job. This was my second season, midsummer, a stretch of about 10 days where I hadn't seen another person at all, not a single backpacking party coming through, which happens occasionally in that particular drainage during certain weeks, depending on permit allocations and trail conditions elsewhere in the district. I'd settled into the rhythm that solitude eventually produces, days structured around trail work and routine checks, evenings spent on the porch reading or doing radio logs. Nothing remarkable about the texture of those particular 10 days beyond their unusual quiet. On the 8th night of that stretch, close to 11, I heard someone walking on the porch. Footsteps, unmistakably, slow and deliberate on the old wooden boards, the specific creak of that particular porch that I'd grown completely familiar with over 2 seasons of walking it myself dozens of times a day. I called out, assuming a backpacker had arrived late and was looking for the ranger, which happens occasionally even at that hour if someone's pushed a long day to reach the cabin before dark and just barely failed. No one answered. The footsteps continued, slow, even, moving the length of the porch and back, the way you'd pace while waiting for someone to come to the door rather than knocking directly. I got up, lit a lantern, and opened the door to find the porch entirely empty, no pack dropped against the railing, no headlamp bobbing away down the trail, nothing. I want to emphasize how thoroughly I checked. I walked the full length of that porch with the lantern, checked the meadow edge where the trail emerges from timber, called out into the dark in both directions, and got nothing back beyond the ordinary night sounds of a high mountain meadow, wind, a distant owl, the creek running somewhere below the cabin. I went back inside eventually, telling myself it had probably been some structural settling in the old logs, the kind of explanation that satisfies you exactly as much as you need it to at 11 at night, alone, 9 miles from anyone. The footsteps came back roughly 40 minutes later. Same pattern, same pace, same length of porch covered and recovered, turning at almost exactly the same point near the porch's east end each time, the precise spot where the boards always sounded slightly different to my own boots because of a warp in that particular section. This time I didn't get up immediately. I lay in the loft listening, trying to convince myself I was hearing settling boards or some animal that had wandered up onto the porch, though nothing about the rhythm matched a deer or an elk investigating an unfamiliar structure, and nothing about the sound suggested 4 legs rather than 2. That detail, the consistency of the turning point matching a real structural feature of the porch rather than some arbitrary spot, is the thing that has stayed with me longest, more than the footsteps themselves. Wind doesn't account for that kind of structural specificity. Settling logs don't produce a sequence of distinct creaks, moving consistently in one direction and then reversing at a fixed point, over and over, across multiple separate occurrences spaced exactly the same interval apart. It happened 3 more times that night, by my count, always roughly 40 minutes apart, always the same unhurried pacing length of the porch. I didn't get up again after the second time. I lay awake until first light, listening, in a state of alertness that left me thoroughly exhausted the next day despite having done nothing physically demanding overnight. I radioed it in the next morning, in the deliberately understated language you learn to use for anything you can't fully explain over a channel other staff might be monitoring, noting unusual nighttime activity near the cabin and requesting if anyone had information about other parties possibly in the area. Dispatch had nothing, no permits issued for that drainage in the relevant window, no other staff scheduled anywhere near my location. What I didn't mention on the radio, and didn't tell anyone for almost a year afterward, was a detail I only learned myself partway through that same season, from an older ranger who'd worked that district for over 2 decades and who happened to be passing through on a multi-day patrol a few weeks after my experience. I mentioned, cautiously, what had happened on the porch, framing it as something I assumed had a mundane explanation I just hadn't found yet. He went quiet for a long moment, the particular quiet I'd learned to recognize over the following years as the specific tell of someone deciding how much institutional history to share with someone too new to the district to have heard it already. He told me that cabin had a documented history, going back decades, of staff reporting almost exactly that experience. Footsteps on the porch at night, no visible source, pacing rather than approaching, always at roughly similar intervals through a given night. He said the pattern had been noted often enough over the years that it had become a quiet, semi-institutional piece of knowledge among longer-tenured staff in that district, never formally written up anywhere because there was nothing actionable to write up, but passed along informally to new seasonal staff who seemed like they could handle hearing it without it affecting their willingness to do the job. He'd clearly decided, watching how I'd brought it up myself unprompted, that I qualified. He also told me something else, more carefully, that he said he wasn't fully certain connected to the porch footsteps, but that felt relevant given how directly I'd asked. Decades earlier, before either of us had worked that district, a solo hiker had gone missing on a trail system roughly 6 miles from that same cabin, in terrain technically outside the cabin's regular patrol area, but close enough that the original search had used the cabin as a staging point for several days. The hiker was never found, despite an extensive search that covered weeks rather than days, an unusually long and well-resourced effort for that era given the remoteness of the terrain involved, with search teams operating out of that same porch I now knew so well, sleeping in the same loft, presumably noting the same creak in the same boards as they came and went on their search patterns each morning. He said he'd looked into the old case file himself once, years into his own tenure in that district, out of the same compulsive curiosity that I now recognized in myself, and that the file described search dogs behaving unusually agitated near the cabin itself on at least 2 occasions during the search, refusing at one point to approach a particular section of the porch closely without clear handler encouragement, a detail that the original report attributed, vaguely, to unfamiliar scent or general search fatigue without further elaboration. He said he didn't put much weight on that detail himself, given how unreliable secondhand accounts of working dog behavior tend to be decades after the fact, but that he hadn't been able to fully set it aside either, especially not after hearing my own account of footsteps turning at a fixed point near that same general section of porch. He was careful to say he wasn't suggesting any direct connection, that he didn't have a theory linking the missing hiker to the footsteps, and that he mentioned it only because the cabin's strange reputation and that old case had always existed alongside each other in his own mind. 2 unresolved things from the same patch of remote country that had never quite separated cleanly despite having no documented relationship to each other. I finished that season without further incidents of that specific kind, though I noticed, looking back at my own logs afterward, 2 other nights with brief notes about hearing something on the porch that I dismissed in the moment as wind or settling without giving it the same weight as that one extended night. I didn't return to that district the following year, for reasons that had more to do with wanting different experience on my resume than any decision driven by what had happened, though I won't pretend the timing was entirely coincidental in my own mind. I've stayed in touch loosely with a few people who worked that same cabin in years after I left, and at least 2 of them, without my prompting either of them directly, have mentioned some version of the same porch experience unprompted in casual conversation, treating it as a known quirk of that particular posting rather than anything they felt the need to dwell on. One of them described it happening on only a single night during her entire season, much shorter in duration than my own extended night, but matching every other detail closely enough that I didn't need to ask follow-up questions to know we were describing the same thing. The other described a longer stretch similar to mine, several nights spread across roughly 2 weeks, and admitted that by the end of that stretch, she'd started sleeping with a knife within reach on her nightstand, not because she believed it would help against anything genuinely supernatural, but because having it there made the nights marginally easier to get through. Neither of them knew about the missing hiker case until I mentioned it, and both reacted to that detail with the same uneasy, unresolved quiet I imagine I gave the older ranger who first told me. I've also, in the years since leaving that job, tried a few times to track down more detail on the original disappearance through public records and old newspaper archives, with limited success given how long ago it happened and how sparse documentation tends to be for missing person cases in genuinely remote wilderness from that era. What I did find confirmed the basic outline the older ranger had given me: a solo hiker, a multi-week search, no resolution, without adding much beyond what I already knew, leaving me in the same position as everyone else who's encountered this story, holding two unresolved facts that sit uncomfortably close together in the same small patch of country, without any way to prove or disprove a connection between them. I don't know what was walking that porch at roughly 40-minute intervals on otherwise ordinary summer nights, in a cabin 9 miles from the nearest road, built decades before any of us were assigned to live there temporarily and watch over country that occasionally, and without much fanfare, simply doesn't give people back. What I know is that the pattern has outlasted every individual ranger who's ever heard it, passed down quietly from one season's staff to the next, attached loosely but persistently to a disappearance that predates the pattern's documented history by years, in country that remains, by any honest measure, exactly as remote and exactly as indifferent to being fully understood as it was the night I first heard those footsteps cross the porch and turn back without ever once reaching the door. I think about that, sometimes on quiet nights wherever I happen to be living now, far from any porch and any meadow and any 9-mile trail, that somewhere in that drainage, a cabin built in the 1930s is most likely standing empty between rotations even now, and that whatever has been pacing its porch for the better part of a century, give or take, is presumably still out there, waiting for whoever the district assigns next. The snow line. I've cross-country skied and snowshoed in backcountry terrain for about 15 years, mostly in the mountains of northern Vermont and occasionally into New Hampshire, doing multi-day winter trips that involve breaking trail through unmarked terrain, setting up camp in snow shelters or a four-season tent, and traveling through country that, in winter, sees almost no other human traffic at all beyond the occasional other backcountry skier on a popular ridge. Winter travel has a specific quality of isolation that summer backpacking doesn't quite match, because the cold itself filters out almost everyone except people who are genuinely committed to being out there, and the kind of remote drainages I prefer to travel and see, by my own rough estimate over the years, somewhere under 10 parties total across an entire winter season. One of the specific pleasures of that kind of winter travel, for me, has always been reading sign in fresh snow, which is dramatically easier than reading sign on bare ground, because snow holds an impression so cleanly and for so long under cold conditions. You can tell, with real confidence, what's moved through an area overnight, how recently, in what direction, sometimes even at what pace, in a way that summer ground conditions rarely allow with the same clarity. After 15 years of winter travel, I consider myself genuinely skilled at this specific kind of tracking, comfortable identifying everything from moose and deer to the full range of mid-sized predators native to that region, including the subtler distinctions between, say, a healthy coyote's gait and a coyote moving with an injury, the kind of detail that only comes from years of accumulated, repeated observation. This was 2 winters ago, a 5-day solo trip into a remote drainage in northern Vermont that I'd done a version of twice before, breaking trail on snowshoes to a base camp roughly 6 miles from the nearest plowed road, in conditions that had been consistently below freezing for the entire trip, with no freeze cycles to complicate how cleanly the snow was holding tracks. The drainage itself runs between two minor peaks, narrow enough in places that the terrain funnels travel along a fairly predictable corridor even without a marked trail, which is part of why I'd chosen it originally as a reliable winter route, and part of why, in hindsight, it also made sense as the kind of corridor any larger animal moving through that country might naturally follow as well. Fresh snow had fallen the second night of the trip, maybe 4 inches, providing about as clean a tracking surface as that terrain ever produces. On the morning after that snowfall, I woke and unzipped my tent to find a single line of tracks running directly past my camp, close enough that they passed within maybe 15 feet of my tent door, continuing in a straight line through the otherwise undisturbed fresh snow in both directions as far as I could see before the terrain curved out of sight. My first reaction, before I'd even processed any specific detail, was simple confusion at the sheer fact of it, because the 4 inches of overnight snowfall meant anything walking through after it stopped should have left perfectly clean, undisturbed impressions, and the complete absence of my own tracks crossing this new line told me it had happened sometime after I'd gone fully to sleep, in conditions cold and still enough that the snow surface hadn't crusted or shifted at all overnight. The tracks themselves were the first thing that struck me as wrong, well before I started thinking about anything more specific. They were bipedal, clearly so, evenly spaced in a stride pattern consistent with a tall, upright animal walking rather than bounding or loping, but roughly 16 inches long by my own measurement using my ski pole as a rough scale, considerably larger than any human boot print and proportioned differently than any human print I've ever seen, wider through the midfoot with what looked like a long, continuous impression rather than the heel and ball pattern a human gait produces. The stride length between individual prints measured close to 4 feet, consistently, for as far as I tracked the line, a spacing that would require an unusually tall individual to produce comfortably while walking rather than running, and the depth of each impression in the soft snow suggested considerable weight behind each step, deeper than my own prints despite my carrying a loaded winter pack. I want to walk through every explanation I tried to apply before accepting that none of them satisfied me. A human in oversized snowshoes was my first thought, except snowshoe prints look nothing like this. They're flat, uniform impressions from the shoe's frame and decking, not an organic, toed shape with what appeared to be 5 distinct toe impressions at the leading edge of each print, visible clearly enough in the cold, dry snow that I could make out individual toe marks without needing to brush away any accumulated surface texture. I also considered whether a person on foot, without snowshoes, could have produced this by sinking deeply enough into the snow that the resulting impression simply looked larger and more distorted than an actual boot print, a phenomenon I have genuinely seen before in soft, deep powder. But that explanation requires inconsistent sinking depth depending on exact snow density along the route, and what I was looking at showed remarkably consistent depth and shape across dozens of individual prints over a quarter mile, which doesn't match the kind of irregular distortion that soft snow sinking typically produces. And I also couldn't account for why anyone would be walking that particular stretch of unmarked backcountry, barefoot or otherwise, in the middle of a freezing winter night, 6 miles from the nearest plowed road. A moose or other large ungulate doesn't produce a bipedal track at all, obviously, and neither does any bear, since even a bear walking briefly on its hind legs, something black bears do occasionally for short distances when investigating something at height, produces a recognizably different, flatter, more splayed print than what I was looking at, and certainly doesn't maintain a consistent bipedal stride over any meaningful distance the way these tracks did. Bears that do walk briefly upright also tend to show clear evidence of having dropped back to 4 legs within a short distance, since sustaining an upright gait is metabolically expensive and not something any quadruped does without a specific, short-term reason. I followed the trail in one direction for close to a quarter mile before turning back, and it never reverted to a 4-point gait anywhere along that stretch, maintaining the same even, bipedal stride the entire way I tracked it, climbing over one small fallen log along the route in a way that, if anything, made the bipedal interpretation harder to dismiss rather than easier, since the prints on either side of the log showed a stepping over motion entirely consistent with an upright gait, clearing an obstacle, rather than the scrabbling, 4-point disturbance you'd expect from most quadrupeds navigating the same obstacle. I photographed extensively, including close-up shots with my ski pole laid alongside individual prints for scale, wide shots showing the stride pattern over distance, and shots of the trail relative to my own camp to document how close it had actually passed, along with a shot of the log crossing point specifically because it struck me, even in the moment, as a detail worth documenting carefully. I also did something I don't normally bother with on a solo trip. I made a deliberate decision to break camp early and move my route for the remainder of the trip away from the direction the tracks had been heading, a decision I made consciously rather than purely on instinct, weighing the actual, practical risk against the unease I was feeling and deciding the unease alone was reason enough, even though every rational part of my training told me that whatever had made those tracks had passed by hours earlier and posed no detectable ongoing threat to my position. I spent a long while, before finally breaking camp, simply standing at the edge of my tent site studying the trail in both directions, trying to gauge from the snow whether the animal, whatever it was, had paused anywhere near my camp, lingered, or shown any sign of having taken specific interest in my presence rather than simply passing through on an indifferent, straight-line route. As best I could tell, it hadn't paused at all. The stride remained perfectly even the entire distance I could see in both directions, no broken rhythm, no doubling back, no compression in the snow suggesting it had stopped to stand and look toward my tent, which I took, at the time, as the single most reassuring detail of the entire morning, even though reassurance feels like an odd word for anything connected to this particular memory. I finished the remaining 3 days of that trip without seeing the tracks again, returned home, and spent a genuinely embarrassing number of hours over the following weeks comparing my photographs against every reference image I could find of known animal gaits in snow, trying to find something that matched closely enough to let the whole thing settle into an ordinary explanation. I went through state wildlife agency track guides, university extension publications on snow tracking, and a handful of more specialized forums dedicated to winter wildlife tracking where experienced trackers post photos asking for identification, help from each other, cross-referencing my own measurements against dozens of confirmed examples of moose, bear, and large canine tracks in comparable snow conditions. Nothing matched cleanly. The closest comparison I found, ironically, was reference material specifically related to reported Sasquatch track casts, a category of evidence I'd always been deeply skeptical of and remain skeptical of in general, but that nonetheless matched the toe pattern and proportions of what I'd photographed more closely than any legitimate wildlife reference did, a conclusion I arrived at reluctantly and checked multiple times specifically because I didn't want it to be true. I also went back through my own trip log from that week, checking weather data and moon phase for that specific night, partly out of a need to rule out anything environmental that might explain an unusual animal behavior pattern, and partly just to keep myself occupied with something that felt productive rather than simply sitting with the unresolved strangeness of the whole thing. The night in question had been clear and calm after the snow stopped falling, with a waning gibbous moon providing enough ambient light that, in theory, something moving through that terrain would have had reasonably good visibility without needing to navigate by scent or sound alone, a detail that didn't resolve anything specific, but that I noted carefully anyway. The way you collect details when you're hoping one of them will eventually click into place and explain everything. I brought my photographs, eventually, to a wildlife biologist I know through a mutual connection in the backcountry skiing community, someone with specific expertise in winter ungulate and predator ecology for that exact region, hoping for a confident, deflating explanation that would let me file the whole thing away. She looked through the images carefully, asked several specific questions about snow conditions and the exact timing relative to the snowfall, including the overnight temperature and whether there'd been any wind that might have affected how the snow surface had set. Details I was able to answer precisely because I'd logged them as part of my normal trip routine regardless of anything unusual happening. She pulled up the print measurements I'd taken and compared them side by side against reference images on her laptop from her own professional archive of regional wildlife tracks, working through the comparison out loud in a way that made it easy for me to follow her reasoning rather than simply waiting for a verdict. She ruled out moose calf tracks, which she said people occasionally misidentify in certain snow conditions, within about 2 minutes, citing the wrong proportion of width to length and the complete absence of the characteristic dewclaw marks that moose tracks almost always show in snow deep enough to register them. She spent longer on the bear on hind legs hypothesis, pulling up several reference photos of black bear tracks from upright movement, but ultimately set that aside too, for the same reasons I'd already worked through myself: the absence of any reversion to a 4-point gait, the clean toe definition, and the consistency of stride length over distance, none of which match the labored, unstable pattern that bears produce when walking upright for any sustained stretch. She ultimately told me she didn't have a confident explanation either, which surprised me less by that point than it probably should have, given how thoroughly I'd already worked through the same possibilities myself in the weeks beforehand without landing anywhere satisfying. She did mention, somewhat reluctantly, that she'd heard informal accounts from at least 2 other backcountry travelers over the years describing similar bipedal tracks in remote sections of that same general mountain range, always after fresh snowfall, always maintaining a consistent bipedal stride over distance rather than reverting to a more typical animal gait. She said she'd never taken those accounts especially seriously before, treating them as probably misidentified moose or bear tracks distorted by snow conditions, the explanation she'd reflexively reach for professionally. But she said my photographs, with the clear scale references and the close-up toe detail, were considerably harder to dismiss with that same explanation than the second-hand accounts had been, since most prior reports she'd heard were verbal descriptions without supporting photography of this quality. She asked if she could keep copies of my photographs to compare against any future reports that came her way, treating the whole thing, appropriately for her position, as data worth retaining rather than a conclusion worth committing to either direction. I said yes, and we've stayed in occasional contact since, though as of the writing of this, she hasn't reported finding anything that resolves the question one way or the other, and I've come to appreciate that particular kind of professional restraint more than I expected to, given how much I'd originally wanted a confident answer one way or the other rather than an honest acknowledgement of uncertainty. I still do winter backcountry trips every season, and I haven't let what I found change the basic shape of how I travel in winter, because the terrain and the conditions are what they are regardless of one unexplained set of tracks, and the things that genuinely threaten winter travelers, hypothermia, avalanche, a bad fall on exposed ice, remain exactly as real and exactly as deserving of my attention as they were before that trip. But I notice myself, now, examining fresh snow with a different kind of attention than I used to, less purely technical and more genuinely apprehensive, half hoping and half dreading that I'll one day find that same bipedal trail crossing my own tracks again, in country that gets cold and quiet enough, for long enough each winter, that almost anything could move through it largely undetected by anyone who isn't specifically out there looking, at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the right kind of fresh, undisturbed snow, leaving behind nothing but a clean, deliberate line of prints that no one will likely cross again before the next storm erases them completely. The spring house. I bought 40 acres of mostly wooded land in the Ozarks about 8 years ago, hill country in southern Missouri, the kind of property that came with an old, mostly collapsed homestead from sometime in the early 20th century, including a stone spring house built over a natural spring that still ran clean and cold despite decades of neglect. I bought the land specifically for that water source and for the privacy, intending to eventually build a small off-grid cabin there. And in the meantime, I camped on the property regularly while I cleared brush and planned the build. The hollow the property sits in is narrow and steep-sided, classic Ozark karst country, riddled with sinkholes and small cave openings throughout the surrounding hills, the kind of terrain that produces an unusual number of springs relative to its size because of how the underlying limestone channels groundwater toward the surface in concentrated points rather than spreading it evenly. The spring house itself is a simple structure, maybe 8 feet by 10, dry-stacked stone walls about waist height topped with old, rotted timber framing that I've since had to partially rebuild, built directly over the spring so that the water runs through a stone channel at the base before continuing downhill toward a small seasonal creek. Whoever built it, probably the original homesteaders close to a century ago, clearly understood stonework, because the structure has survived decades of weather and neglect better than almost anything else on the property, including the original house foundation itself, which has mostly collapsed into an unrecognizable scatter of fieldstone and rotted sill logs a short distance uphill. This was about 3 years ago, my 4th or 5th overnight camping trip on the land, while I worked through the early stages of clearing a building site about 100 yards from the spring house. I'd set up my tent in a flat clearing within sight of the old structure, partly because it was the most level ground on that section of the property and partly, I'll admit, because I liked having that old stonework as a kind of anchor point, a visible piece of the land's history while I was reshaping the rest of it. By that point, I'd already spent close to a dozen nights total on the property across various trips, enough to have developed a genuine, comfortable familiarity with its ordinary nighttime sounds, which is part of why what happened that particular night stood out as clearly as it did rather than blending into a general, undifferentiated unease about sleeping alone on undeveloped land. I was woken sometime after midnight by a sound I initially took for running water changing pitch, a kind of irregular splashing that didn't match the steady, consistent trickle I'd grown used to hearing from the spring house every night I'd camped there. I'd spent enough nights on that property by that point to have a genuinely reliable baseline for what that water sounded like under different conditions, after rain, during a dry spell, in different seasons as the flow rate naturally fluctuated, and what I was hearing didn't fit any of those ordinary variations. I lay still for a while, listening, trying to place the sound more specifically, and the longer I listened the less it sounded like water doing anything water normally does on its own, more like something moving through the channel deliberately, displacing water in irregular bursts rather than the constant, predictable flow I knew that spring to produce. I got up eventually, took my flashlight, and walked the short distance to the spring house, maybe 60 yards from my tent through low brush that I'd already cleared enough to navigate easily even in the dark, telling myself the most likely explanation was a raccoon or possum working the water for food, something I'd seen evidence of before in the form of small tracks in the mud near the channel's outlet. When I got close enough to shine the light directly into the structure, the splashing stopped immediately, abruptly enough that the timing itself struck me as strange even before I'd had a chance to actually see anything, and the beam found nothing inside but the ordinary stone channel and the steady, unbroken flow of clean spring water moving exactly the way it always had. I stood there for a long minute, scanning every corner of that small structure with the flashlight, checking behind the low stone walls and along the edges where something small might have ducked out of sight, even crouching down to check underneath the timber framing where a possum or raccoon could conceivably have wedged itself into a gap. There was nowhere, realistically, for an animal of any meaningful size to have hidden in that brief window between my approach and my light reaching the interior, given how open and unobstructed the inside of the spring house actually is, with no dense brush or debris anywhere nearby, that would have offered a quick escape route either. I went back to my tent uneasy but not yet alarmed, chalking it up to a startled animal that had simply slipped out faster than I could track it, an explanation that satisfied me for almost exactly as long as it took me to lie back down. The splashing came back about 30 minutes later, the same irregular pattern, and this time I didn't get up right away. I lay in my tent listening for several minutes, and at some point during that stretch, I became convinced, and I want to be honest that conviction is a strong word for something I can't fully prove, that I could hear something underneath the splashing that sounded distinctly like low, irregular breathing, not panting in the way a startled animal breathes, but slower, more deliberate. The kind of breathing you associate with something at rest rather than something disturbed or fleeing. The two sounds together, the irregular splashing and that slow, underlying breath, created an impression that was harder to dismiss than either sound would have been alone, because together they suggested something settled and comfortably rather than something passing through opportunistically. I didn't go back to check that second time. I stayed in my tent until the sound eventually faded sometime well before dawn, and I got very little actual sleep that night, alert in the specific way that makes you aware of every small sound the woods around a tent normally produce, magnified by the singular strangeness of what I'd already heard. I remember running through every animal native to that part of the Ozarks that I could think of, trying to find one whose behavior might plausibly account for sustained, irregular splashing paired with audible breathing at that volume from 60 yards away, and coming up empty on every attempt, since nothing in that ecosystem, from black bear down to the smallest mustelid, behaves quite that way around a water source at night. In the morning, I walked back to the spring house in full daylight and examined it as thoroughly as I knew how, checking the mud at the channel's edges for tracks, checking the interior stonework for any sign of disturbance, even running my hand along the inside walls in case something had left fur or hair caught on the rough stone. I found nothing beyond the ordinary, undisturbed flow of water that the structure has produced reliably for as long as I've owned the property, no tracks in mud that should have held an impression, no scent, nothing that gave me any physical evidence to weigh against what I'd clearly heard twice over the course of one increasingly long night. I mentioned the experience, somewhat reluctantly, to an elderly neighbor whose family has lived adjacent to my property for 4 generations, a woman in her 80s who spent her entire life in that hollow and who knows the history of every structure and every old homestead boundary in the immediate area better than any county record could tell you. The kind of person who can still point out, from memory, exactly where a barn used to stand on a piece of land that's been fully wooded over 50 years. I expected her to laugh it off as a startled animal, the same explanation I'd tried to settle on myself, since that's generally been her reaction to most of my other questions about strange noises or unfamiliar tracks on the property over the years. Instead, she asked, very directly, before I'd even finished describing the second incident, whether the sound had come with anything that sounded like breathing. When I told her yes, she went quiet for a long moment and then told me that Spring House had a reputation in her family going back to her own grandmother's stories, decades before either of us were born, of something using the water at night, described in almost exactly the same terms I'd just used, irregular splashing, an underlying breathing sound, nothing ever seen despite repeated checking. She said her grandmother had referred to it, half-jokingly within the family, but apparently believed more seriously than the joking suggested, as the spring's other tenant, a phrase she said had been used in that family for at least 3 generations without anyone ever fully explaining what it meant or where the phrase had originated, treated by that point more as an inherited piece of vocabulary than an active belief anyone felt the need to defend or examine closely. She told me her own father, this woman's son, had heard something similar himself as a young man, decades before I bought the property, on a section of land that at the time belonged to her family rather than the separate homestead whose ruins now sit on mine, close enough geographically that she'd always assumed, without ever confirming it formally, that both experiences traced back to the same source, whatever that source actually was, possibly something that moved between the several springs, that fed that whole hollow's water table rather than being permanently attached to any single one. She said her father had never gone looking for an explanation either, treating it instead as simply one of the things you learn to live alongside in that particular hollow, the way you learn to live alongside copperheads or flash floods, respected rather than fully understood. She added, almost as an afterthought near the end of that conversation, that her grandmother had once mentioned the sound seeming to change over the decades she'd lived with it, the splashing growing less frequent in her later years compared to how often she remembered hearing it as a young woman, a detail my neighbor offered without any particular theory attached, simply as one more piece of an oral history that had never been written down anywhere and existed now only in her own memory of being told these stories as a child sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table. She said she sometimes wondered whether that decline in frequency meant whatever it was had simply moved on to a different spring somewhere else in the hollow, or whether it meant something else entirely that she'd rather not speculate about out loud. I asked her, carefully, whether she thought it was dangerous, whether her family had ever taken any precautions around that spring house specifically. She said no one in her family had ever been harmed by it as far as she knew, across what she estimated was close to a century of intermittent encounters spread across at least 3 generations, and that the closest thing to a precaution her family had ever practiced was simply not lingering near that water source too late into the night, a habit she said had calcified into family custom long before anyone bothered to articulate the reasoning behind it explicitly, the kind of rule that gets passed down to children as simply how things are done without ever being framed as a response to anything specific. I asked her, too, whether she'd ever heard of similar accounts attached to any of the other springs in that hollow, given how many small water sources that particular stretch of karst country. She thought about it for a while and said she vaguely recalled one other story, secondhand and much less detailed, about a spring on a different piece of property a couple of hollows over, though she couldn't recall whose land it had been on or confirm whether the account actually matched what either of us had experienced ourselves. She said that kind of vague, half-remembered overlap is common enough in oral history passed down through rural families in that region, and that she'd learned not to put too much weight on it without more specific corroboration. The same caution I found myself applying to my own account whenever I tried to present it to anyone outside that immediate conversation. I tried, afterward, to ask around a little further among other longtime residents of that hollow, mostly older farmers and a couple of retired loggers who'd worked that ground their whole lives, framing my questions vaguely enough that I wasn't leading anyone toward a specific answer. Most had nothing to offer, or politely changed the subject in a way that suggested either genuine ignorance or a simple unwillingness to discuss it with someone they didn't know especially well, which in a close rural community is itself a meaningful kind of response. One older man, a retired logger in his 70s, did tell me, almost in passing, that he'd always avoided cutting timber too close to any spring source in that hollow regardless of how good the stand looked on paper, a habit he attributed to something his own father had drilled into him as a young man, without ever fully explaining the reasoning, in language close enough to what my neighbor had described that I came away with one more small, unverifiable thread pointing in the same general direction. I've continued camping on that property in the years since, including several more nights within sight of the spring house, and I haven't heard anything like that again. Though I'll admit I've structured at least a few of those later trips to avoid camping quite as close to the structure as I did that first time, telling myself it's simply a more practical site for other reasons while knowing, honestly, that the real reason is harder to admit out loud. I finished my cabin build last year, on the original site I'd cleared, close enough to the spring house that I still draw water from it daily. An arrangement that means I think about that one night more often than I probably should for something I never managed to see, explain, or fully resolve. I don't know what was using that spring at midnight 3 years ago, splashing in a pattern no animal I've ever encountered quite matches, breathing in a rhythm that read as resting rather than fleeing, vanishing completely from a small, open structure with nowhere obvious to hide in the brief seconds between my approach and my light reaching the interior. I know that an elderly woman who has spent her entire life within walking distance of that exact spring described, unprompted and in close detail, a multi-generational family history of the same essential experience, attached to a spring her own family doesn't own and has no particular stake in protecting through exaggeration. Whatever the spring's other tenant actually is, it seems to have been there, by every account I can gather, for considerably longer than anyone currently living has been alive to ask it why, and I draw my water from that same channel every single day now, telling myself, most mornings, that a century of mostly quiet coexistence is its own kind of reassurance. Even on the mornings when I'm not entirely sure I believe it, filling my kettle from a spring that has apparently been sharing itself with something else for longer than my own family has owned a single acre of that land. The Switchback. I've been a serious day hiker for almost 15 years, mostly in the Cascades, and I've logged more solo miles than I could accurately count, on trails ranging from groomed national park routes to barely marked use trails that see maybe a dozen people a season. I say this not to establish any particular authority, but because what happened to me happened on a trail I knew extremely well, on a section I'd hiked probably 30 times before, which matters for how much weight I give my own account of it. The trail in question climbs a series of switchbacks up a steep drainage to a ridge, gaining about 2,600 feet over 4 miles, with the lower switchbacks running close along the edge of a deep, narrow ravine cut by a seasonal creek. The drop into that ravine in places is sheer enough that a fall would be serious, maybe fatal depending on where exactly you went over, and there's a stretch of about half a mile where the trail and the ravine edge run within 10 or 15 feet of each other with no real barrier beyond common sense and a healthy respect for exposed terrain. The ravine floor itself is dense and largely impassable in most places, choked with vine, maple, and down timber that's been accumulating for decades, the kind of terrain that would take serious effort and a good reason to actually descend into rather than simply observe from above, which is part of why it's never struck me, on any of my prior 30-some trips through that section, as a place anyone would have cause to be. This was 3 years ago, a weekday in early autumn, the kind of trail conditions I actively prefer: quiet, cool, low traffic, good visibility through the thinning canopy. I'd started early, before sunrise, planning to be up and back down before the trail got any midday traffic, which on a weekday in that season usually meant I might pass 2 or 3 other parties the entire day, sometimes none at all. I was about 90 minutes in, working through the switchback section above the ravine, when I heard my name called from somewhere below me, down in the ravine itself. Clearly, unmistakably my actual first name, not a generic shout or a hello, called once, in a voice I couldn't immediately place as male or female, pitched in a way that didn't carry the urgency of someone in distress, but also didn't sound entirely casual either. It had a flatness to it that I've struggled to describe accurately to anyone since, a quality somewhere between someone reading a name off a list and someone genuinely trying to get my attention, and that ambiguity is part of what made the moment so hard to process in real time. I stopped on the trail and looked down into the ravine, which at that section was maybe 80 feet below the switchback I was standing on, choked with brush and down timber and the kind of terrain nobody would casually wander into without a specific reason. I didn't see anyone. I called back, the reflexive thing you do, asking if someone needed help, getting only the sound of the creek and wind moving through the canopy in response, a silence that felt, in the moment, almost like a held breath rather than simple emptiness, though I recognize how much of that impression is colored by what I already suspected rather than anything I could have objectively measured. I want to be precise about why this unsettled me beyond the obvious strangeness of a disembodied voice using my actual name. I hike alone deliberately and don't tell many people my specific route on a given day, certainly not in time for someone to have gotten ahead of me on the trail, dropped into that ravine, and called up to me by name as some kind of prank, which was the first explanation I tried to force the situation into. I also hadn't seen a single other vehicle in the trailhead lot that morning, and the trail register, which I checked on my way past, showed no other entries for that day. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the ravine as carefully as the brush allowed, before deciding that the most likely explanation was an auditory illusion of some kind, a trick of wind and water sound that my brain had organized into the shape of my own name, something I'd read about happening to other hikers in similarly acoustic terrain, where moving water can produce surprisingly voice-like frequencies under the right conditions. I didn't fully believe that explanation even as I was constructing it, but it let me keep moving, and I continued up the switchbacks toward the ridge. About 15 minutes later, near the top of that same switchback section, I heard it again. Same word, my name, same general direction below me, though by that point the ravine had widened slightly, and the drop wasn't quite as severe. This time the voice sounded, if anything, slightly closer, though I recognize that impression is hard to verify objectively given how sound travels in that kind of terrain. I didn't stop walking that time. I kept my pace steady, deliberately didn't look down into the ravine, and didn't call back, operating on an instinct I couldn't fully justify in the moment, but that felt, somehow, like the correct response. I finished the hike without further incident, reached the ridge, took my usual break, and came back down a different trail that didn't pass through the ravine section, a route choice I told myself was just for variety, but that I now recognize was at least partly motivated by not wanting to walk that stretch again so soon after. I mentioned the experience, cautiously, to a ranger at the trailhead kiosk a few weeks later, someone I'd spoken with before on previous trips, and who I knew to be level-headed rather than prone to humoring hikers' imaginations. I expected either a dismissive explanation about acoustics, or possibly a gentle suggestion that I'd misheard wind. Instead, she went quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how much professional caution to apply to what she was about to say, and asked whether I'd heard it once or more than once. When I told her twice, she nodded slowly and said that ravine section had a quiet reputation among the handful of rangers and search and rescue volunteers who worked that district regularly, going back at least as long as she'd been stationed there, which was going on 9 years. She said multiple hikers over the years had reported hearing their own name called from inside that ravine, always from below the trail, always in that same general stretch, and that as far as she knew, nobody had ever found a source for it despite at least 2 informal searches of the ravine floor conducted after particularly persistent reports, neither of which turned up anything more notable than the usual debris you'd expect to find in terrain that gets almost no human traffic: old, deadfall, animal trails, nothing suggesting any kind of sustained human presence or any obvious source for a calling voice. She told me, somewhat reluctantly, that the ravine had also been the site of a search and rescue operation almost 2 decades earlier, for a hiker who'd gone missing on that same trail and was never found, despite an extensive multi-day search that covered the ravine thoroughly at the time. She was careful to say she wasn't suggesting any connection, that she didn't have a theory and didn't want one, and that she mentioned the missing hiker only because I'd asked directly whether anything else unusual had ever happened in that section, and it felt dishonest not to share it once I had. I asked her why, if this was a known pattern among rangers, there wasn't some kind of formal advisory or trail note about it. She said, plainly, that there's no actionable warning to give hikers about a sound with no verified source and no documented harm ever resulting from it, and that flagging it officially would likely do more to alarm people than to protect them, a logic I understood, even if it left me with exactly the kind of unresolved unease I'd been hoping a ranger's explanation might dissolve. I've hiked that trail several times since, always during the lower traffic shoulder seasons I prefer, and I haven't heard my name called again in that ravine, though I notice myself listening for it every single time I pass through that stretch, in a way I never used to listen for anything beyond ordinary trail sounds. I don't avoid the trail. I love that trail, and the rest of it has never given me a reason to feel uneasy. But that half-mile of switchback above the ravine has a different quality to it now, a kind of charged quiet that I don't fully know how to explain to people who haven't experienced it themselves, and that I suspect I share, in some unspoken way, with however many other hikers have heard the exact same thing called up to them from a ravine that, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, has nothing down there capable of calling anything at all. What I haven't mentioned yet, and what came back to me only gradually over the months following that ranger conversation, was a detail from the search and rescue effort she described that I went looking for afterward in old local news archives, mostly out of a compulsion I couldn't fully justify to myself at the time. The missing hiker, according to a short article from a regional paper, had been reported by a hiking partner who said they'd become separated on that same switchback section, with the partner recalling, almost as an aside near the end of the article, that they'd heard what they thought was their friend's voice calling from below the trail sometime after the separation, before search efforts began in earnest. The partner had assumed at the time it was simply their friend somewhere nearby and hadn't thought much of the detail until being interviewed afterward, when the inconsistency between that voice and the eventual search radius became impossible to reconcile. I don't want to overstate what that detail means. News archives from 2 decades ago, especially for a regional story that never escalated into anything larger, are not reliable sources in the way I'd want them to be for a claim this significant, and I have no way to verify the accuracy of that one secondhand quote beyond the article itself. But reading it, alone at my kitchen table years after my own experience, produced a specific kind of cold feeling that I haven't fully shaken since, the sense of 2 separate pieces of information sliding into alignment in a way I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. I brought this detail back to the same ranger on a later trip, mentioning what I'd found and asking, carefully, whether she'd been aware of that specific detail from the original case. She said she had, vaguely, from conversations with more senior staff who'd been around at the time of the original search, though she said it wasn't something formally documented in any file she'd personally had access to, more a piece of institutional memory that got mentioned occasionally and then mostly left alone, the way a lot of unresolved things in that line of work eventually get handled by simply not discussing them very often. I also, in the time since, connected with another hiker through an online forum dedicated to trails in that range, someone who'd posted a brief, almost embarrassed account of hearing their own name called from a ravine on a trail they described in enough detail that I was confident it was the same section, though they hadn't named the trail outright, clearly out of the same wariness about credibility that had kept me quiet for so long myself. I messaged them directly, explained my own experience without leading with too much detail so as not to contaminate whatever they told me next, and asked if they'd be willing to compare notes over a longer conversation. They confirmed it was the same trail, the same general stretch of switchbacks, and that they'd heard it exactly once, a single call of their own name, on a solo hike roughly 4 years before mine, in a different season entirely, which ruled out any explanation involving some specific seasonal condition unique to the time of year I'd been hiking. They told me they'd never reported it to anyone at the trailhead or to any ranger, partly out of the same hesitation I'd felt myself, the worry that describing it accurately would make you sound less credible rather than more, and partly because, in their words, they decided almost immediately afterward that they didn't want an explanation badly enough to go looking for one. They said the feeling that came over them in that moment was less fear, specifically, than a kind of overwhelming, bone-deep wrongness, a sense that something about the basic order of that stretch of trail had been violated in a way they couldn't name, and that the sensation had taken the better part of a year to fully fade. I asked them, as I'd asked the ranger, whether the voice had sounded happy, sad, urgent, or neutral, trying to find some emotional quality that might point toward an explanation, supernatural or otherwise. They said neutral, almost conversational, the way you'd call someone's name to get their attention rather than to warn them of anything, which matched exactly what I'd experienced myself and gave me, oddly, less comfort than a more obviously distressed tone would have, because a frightened or urgent voice at least implies something recognizably human in its intention. A neutral, conversational tone calling your name from inside a ravine where no person could plausibly be standing carries a different, harder to categorize kind of wrongness. I still hike that trail. I want to be honest that the rational, daylight version of myself genuinely believes there's very likely a mundane explanation buried somewhere in the acoustics of that specific terrain, water and wind and rock combining under particular conditions to produce something the human ear interprets as speech, the same general phenomenon that makes people swear they've heard voices in white noise or in the sound of a running shower. I know that pattern recognition for language is one of the most aggressive, overactive systems our brains run, and that ravines with moving water are exactly the kind of acoustic environment that tends to produce these illusions most reliably, a fact I've read about in enough places since that I almost have it memorized as a reassurance I can recite to myself on the trail. What I can't fully explain away, no matter how many times I walk through that more comfortable daylight reasoning, is the specificity of it. Wind and water might produce something vaguely voice-shaped. They don't typically produce your actual, correct first name twice, in a stretch of trail with a documented history of other hikers reporting the exact same thing, attached to a missing persons case that includes an eerily similar secondhand account from 2 decades before any of us were there to hear it ourselves. That combination of specificity and consistency is the part that keeps me listening every single time I walk that half-mile of switchbacks, for a voice I both hope and dread I'll hear calling my name again from somewhere down in that ravine, where as far as anyone has ever determined, there is nothing down there at all. I've thought, too, about what it would mean to take the ranger's advice at face value and simply treat the absence of any actionable explanation as a reason to stop thinking about it altogether. I haven't managed that, not fully. I still bring it up, carefully, with other hikers I trust on that same trail system, the way you'd quietly test whether someone else has noticed something odd about a familiar place without committing yourself to a theory first. Most haven't heard anything. A few have given me the same uneasy half-smile I imagine I gave the ranger, the look of someone deciding whether this is a safe moment to admit something they've been carrying alone for longer than they meant to. The tree stand. I've bow hunted white-tailed deer for almost 20 years, mostly on public land in southern Missouri, in country that's hilly, heavily wooded, and remote enough in places that you can hunt an entire morning without hearing a road, a dog, or another human voice. Bow season means sitting still for long stretches, often before dawn through mid-morning, in an elevated stand that puts you maybe 15 to 20 feet up a tree, watching a clearing or a travel corridor for deer movement, which means you spend a tremendous amount of time simply being quiet and paying close attention to everything around you. This was 4 seasons ago, opening week, a stand I'd hunted maybe a dozen times before on a piece of public ground that doesn't get heavy pressure because the access requires a longer walk than most hunters are willing to make before daylight. I climbed in well before sunrise, in full dark, the way you always do for a morning sit, and settled in for what I expected to be an ordinary several hours of watching a clearing where I'd had good luck before. I want to describe the stand location itself in a bit more detail because the geography matters for how seriously I take what happened there. The stand sits near the convergence of two minor drainages, overlooking a natural funnel where deer moving between a ridgetop food source and a lower creek bottom are forced through a relatively narrow corridor, which is exactly the kind of terrain feature that makes for a productive stand location in the first place. It's also, I'll admit now with the benefit of hindsight, the kind of terrain that limits sight lines in almost every direction except the one clearing I had a clean view of, meaning anything moving through the surrounding timber had ample cover to stay just outside what I could actually confirm with my eyes. A detail that didn't strike me as significant until I started comparing notes with other hunters who'd had similar experiences in similarly funneled terrain. The walk into that stand, in full dark, takes close to 40 minutes from the nearest reasonable parking area, along an old logging grade that's grown over enough in places that you need a headlamp and some familiarity with the route to follow it confidently without a flashlight beam catching nothing but black timber on either side. I mention the length of that walk because it's relevant to how isolated the stand actually is. By the time legal shooting light arrives, you are a genuine 40-minute walk from your vehicle, through terrain that doesn't have cell coverage, with no other hunters typically within easy shouting distance, given how few people make that particular walk during the regular bow season. About 40 minutes after first light, with the woods fully awake around me, squirrels working through leaf litter, birds calling, the ordinary morning noise of healthy timber, I became aware of something moving below my stand, on the ground, slow and deliberate, circling at what I judged to be maybe 30 or 40 yards out. I assumed initially it was a deer, possibly working scent or moving cautiously the way a mature buck sometimes will, and I went through my usual routine of slowly turning my head to try to locate it without spooking whatever was out there. I never got a clean visual. Whatever was circling stayed just inside the tree lean at the edge of my sight line, never quite stepping into the open clearing I had a clear view of, moving with a patience that struck me, even in the moment, as different from how deer typically behave when they're cautious. Deer move in short bursts usually, a few steps, a pause to look and scent check, more steps. This was a continuous, even pace, circling rather than approaching or retreating, the kind of movement I'd later struggle to describe to other hunters without sounding like I was exaggerating for effect. It circled for what I estimated was close to 20 minutes before going quiet. I sat in that stand for another 3 hours that morning without seeing a single deer, which on its own wasn't unusual, but I came down at midday more rattled than the morning's actual events should have justified, telling myself the obvious things, a hog, possibly, since feral hogs had been expanding into that area and do sometimes move in that kind of sustained, patient pattern, or a coyote working a scent trail methodically rather than directly. That first morning, after the circling went quiet, I spent a long time simply sitting motionless in the stand, the way you're trained to after any disturbance, partly out of genuine hunting strategy and partly, I'll admit, because I wasn't eager to climb down into the same timber that whatever I'd been hearing had just circled through. When I finally did climb down at midday, I spent close to half an hour walking the perimeter of where I'd judged the circling to be happening, checking for tracks in the soft dirt along the drainage bottoms, the kind of careful, methodical check that 20 years of hunting teaches you to do almost automatically after anything unusual. I found deer sign, the ordinary kind you'd expect on a productive piece of ground during the rut buildup, along with what I initially took to be hog rooting near one of the drainage crossings, disturbed leaf litter, and overturned soil consistent with feral hog activity in that region. But I also found, at the edge of that same disturbed area, a single partial print in softer ground that didn't match hog, didn't match deer, and didn't match any canine track I was familiar with, An impression long enough and oddly proportioned enough that I genuinely debated, standing there alone in the woods, whether to photograph it or just convince myself I was misreading an ordinary track distorted by soft, uneven ground. I did photograph it, in the end, though the photo, when I looked at it again later that evening, was frustratingly ambiguous in exactly the way these things always seem to be. Clear enough to know something had made an impression there, vague enough that I couldn't point to a single feature and say definitively that it ruled out every mundane explanation. I've shown that photo to a handful of people since, including an older hunter I'll mention shortly, and the most common reaction has been a kind of uncomfortable shrug, an acknowledgement that it doesn't look like anything they immediately recognize, paired with a clear reluctance to commit to anything stronger than that. I went back to that same stand 4 days later, same time, same setup, and it happened again, almost identically, circling beginning shortly after first light, staying just out of clear sight line, lasting close to the same duration, going quiet at roughly the same point in the morning. This time, toward the end of the circling, I heard something that I still don't have a satisfying explanation for. Two distinct, deliberate sounds that I can only describe as knocks, wood against wood, evenly spaced, coming from roughly the direction the circling had been moving toward just before it stopped. I should mention that the wood knocking on the second morning wasn't an isolated pair of sounds in an otherwise silent woods. In the minutes before it happened, the ambient noise of the forest had noticeably quieted. The squirrels that had been chattering steadily for the better part of an hour went still, and I don't recall hearing a single bird call in roughly the 2 or 3 minutes immediately preceding the knocks, a kind of pressure drop silence that I've since learned other hunters specifically associate with this category of unexplained encounter, though I want to be careful not to overstate how much weight I put on secondhand folklore versus my own direct memory of that particular morning. I'd read about that specific behavior before, in the loose, informal way that hunting forums and campfire conversation pass around stories of unexplained wood knocking associated with Sasquatch folklore specifically, which I want to be honest is not a subject I'd ever taken seriously before that morning. I'm not bringing it up because I believe in any particular explanation. I'm bringing it up because the sound I heard matched, with an unsettling specificity, a phenomenon I'd previously dismissed as campfire nonsense, and hearing it firsthand changed how seriously I was willing to take other hunters' accounts of the same thing. After the second sit, I drove straight to my local archery shop rather than going home first, which in retrospect was its own kind of tell about how much that morning had actually rattled me, since I don't typically go out of my way to talk through a hunt with anyone before I've had time to process it myself. I mentioned both mornings, cautiously, to an older hunter there, a man who's hunted that same general public ground for over 30 years and who I trust to give me a straight, unglamorized answer rather than feed a story for its own sake. He listened to the whole account without interrupting, then asked, very specifically, which stand location I'd been hunting, a level of precision in the question that told me he had some particular reason for asking before I'd even finished answering. When I described the location, he nodded slowly and said he'd stopped hunting that exact stand himself almost a decade earlier, after 2 mornings of nearly identical circling behavior, capped on the second morning by the same wood-knocking sound I described, in the same general direction relative to where the circling had stopped. He said he'd never told many people about it, partly because the story sounds, by his own admission, exactly like the kind of thing that gets hunters written off as unreliable, and partly because he'd never found a satisfying way to wrap it up with an explanation that let him stop thinking about it. The conversation with him gave me both the relief of corroboration and a fresh layer of unease, because hearing that someone else had experienced almost exactly the same thing in the same place, years earlier, did less to normalize the experience than I'd hoped, and more to confirm that whatever had happened to me wasn't a one-time fluke specific to my own state of mind that particular week. He told me he'd talked to one other hunter over the years, a younger guy he trusted, who described a similar morning on a stand maybe half a mile from mine, on the same general piece of public ground, also involving sustained circling just out of sight line and a small number of deliberate knocking sounds toward the end of the encounter. That third hunter, according to what he relayed, had reacted by climbing down early and walking straight out rather than finishing his sit, something he'd apparently been a little embarrassed to admit at the time, framing it afterward as just an off morning rather than describing it in the kind of detail that would have invited questions. 3 different hunters, 3 different mornings spread out across roughly a decade, all describing the same basic pattern on the same general stretch of public timber, with no apparent way any of us could have influenced each other's accounts beforehand, since none of us had discussed the specific stand or drainage with each other prior to comparing notes. I asked him, before we wrapped up that conversation, whether he thought the behavior was territorial in nature, the same kind of boundary patrol idea I'd later hear echoed by other outdoors people describing similar experiences in entirely different settings. He said he didn't know, and that in 30 years of hunting that ground, he'd developed exactly one working theory that satisfied him even partially, that certain stretches of remote, heavily funneled timber simply belong, in some functional sense, to something that doesn't appreciate being hunted nearby, and that the wisest response to that possibility, provable or not, is simply to find another stand. He didn't have a theory he was willing to commit to out loud beyond that, and when I pushed gently, he said something that stuck with me since, that 30 years of hunting that ground had taught him there are certain stands and certain stretches of timber that you simply stop using, not because you can prove anything is wrong with them, but because the cost of being wrong about an explanation that lets you keep hunting there comfortably is higher than the cost of just walking the extra half mile to a different spot. He said he'd come to think of it less as fear and more as a kind of professional respect, the same instinct that tells an experienced woodsman not to ignore a gut feeling about ice thickness or weather even when he can't articulate the specific data behind it. I took his advice, eventually, after one more sit in that same stand the following season that produced nothing unusual at all, no circling, no knocking, nothing beyond an entirely ordinary, quiet morning that should have reassured me and somehow didn't, because by then I'd already started reading the absence of an incident as its own kind of uncertainty rather than evidence that whatever had been there before was simply gone. I moved my setup to a different drainage entirely, productive in its own right, similar terrain features without the same funneled, low-visibility quality that had made the original stand both a great hunting spot and, apparently, a great spot for something else to move through unseen. I haven't gone back to that original stand in 3 years now, despite knowing, rationally, that whatever happened those 2 mornings has no documented connection to any actual danger to a hunter sitting quietly in a tree, no attack, no aggressive escalation, nothing beyond proximity and an unsettling sound. What stays with me, more than the circling itself, is the wood knocking, specifically the evenness of it, 2 deliberate strikes spaced with a regularity that doesn't match anything I associate with branches falling or trees settling in wind, the explanations I'd reflexively reach for if I hadn't already heard, independently, that the same sound had been reported by 2 other hunters on the same general stretch of ground, years apart, with no contact between any of us before we each separately decided we'd rather hunt somewhere else. That kind of unprompted, independent convergence on the same specific detail is the thing I keep coming back to whenever I try to talk myself into a fully mundane explanation, because coincidence has a harder time accounting for 3 strangers describing the identical sound, in the identical rhythm, in the identical patch of timber, than any single account on its own ever could. I've thought a lot, since then, about why the circling itself felt so much worse than an ordinary close encounter with a large, potentially dangerous animal would have. Black bear sightings, even close ones, don't rattle me the way that morning did, because a bear's behavior, even when unpredictable, still reads as recognizably animal, driven by scent, by hunger, by the specific calculus of risk and reward that governs how wildlife actually interacts with a human presence. What circled below my stand didn't read that way. It read as curious in a manner that had nothing to do with food or territory in any sense I could map onto known animal behavior, patient in a way that felt, uncomfortably, more like observation than survival. I still bow hunt every season, still sit alone in elevated stands well before dawn in country remote enough that help would be a long way off if I needed it, and none of this has changed my relationship to the sport in any fundamental sense. But I listen differently now in those first hours of legal light, more attuned to the difference between an animal moving with purpose toward food or away from danger, and something moving with a patience that doesn't seem to need either explanation, content simply to circle, just out of sight, for exactly as long as it wants to, in country that I now understand a little better belongs, on certain mornings, to something other than the deer I'm actually there to hunt.